Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and start recording, and it is now 11 o'clock. And my name is Jennifer Tobin, and I serve as a Deputy Administrator of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series, which was launched in 2019, highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. Today, you're going to hear from two extraordinary individuals about the Open Space Management Guide, which was created by a team of researchers at North Carolina State University with support from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And this guide was created to give communities actionable recommendations about how to develop and implement an open space and management strategy for buyout lands. A few announcements before we begin the formal webinar presentation. This forum is being recorded. The captioned video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website at hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources. In a few moments, I will turn the controls over to today's speaker, but if at any point during the presentation you have a question or comment, please submit those using the chat function or the Q&A box. I will monitor the questions in both places and return to them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Okay, thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Management, we can offer 1 contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive credit, you are required to attend the entire webinar session today. And at the completion of the webinar, you will need to email Katie Murphy at hazctr@colorado.edu, which Katie will also drop in the chat box, to request your certificate. You can also visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. Okay, now we're going to turn to the topic of today's webinar, which spotlights the Open Space Management Guide, Building Community Capacity to Program FEMA-Funded Housing Buyout Land. So using land use and landscape design processes, this guide frames open space design, implementation, and maintenance within FEMA buyout rules and provides local governments with the information they need to access the funding, policy, and technical assistance to manage open spaces. And I know that many of you on this webinar today are always looking for best practice guidelines for managing community buyout programs and mitigating future risk in your communities. This guide is the perfect addition to your current set of resources, as it is truly helping local governments plan for long-term needs and safety of their communities. Therefore, I'm so excited to turn it over to Gavin Smith, who is joined by his research partner here today, Abigail Black from North Carolina State University, to provide more details about this guide. Gavin is a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at North Carolina State University. He is a leading expert in hazards mitigation, disaster recovery, and climate change adaptation through the process of deep community engagement. And Abigail was a graduate research assistant at North Carolina State University. She just got hired on in a new exciting job. And she was part of the research team that created the Open Space Management Guide. She recently graduated with her Master's of Landscape Architecture with a Disaster Resilient Policy, Engineering, and Design certificate. Okay, Gavin, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Share my screen here. Okay, can everyone hear me and see the first slide?
Looks good to me.
Okay, great. Just 2 quick notes. Jennifer, that photo is nice, but I think it's about 15 years old. Maybe I need to send you a new one, but I'll certainly do that. The other thing before I get started, the first slide that Jennifer showed, that was about 5 miles from where I grew up. So I grew up on the coast. Frankly, our family house was destroyed by Hurricane Ike, but we were able to sell it and move on. We had the resources to do so. Just a little bit more about myself. In addition to spending a lot of time in the academy, In a former life in state government, was assistant director of North Carolina Emergency Management, where I led the acquisition of about 5,000 houses in eastern North Carolina. And this is one of the issues that we grappled with and local governments grapple with regularly is what do you do with the land afterwards? And so that's going to be the real focus of our talk. I'm going to walk through a number of slides that explain the guide and may ask Abby on occasion to provide feedback. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And we should have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So as you all know, and I'm not going to belabor this point, and bear with me just a second while I close these the images of our pictures or photographs or whatever, is the issue with buyouts. And I'm going to be focusing on FEMA-funded buyouts and the rules tied to those. As we all know, that land is required to be maintained as open space in perpetuity with certain rules and regulations associated with it. However, what we found is there really isn't extensive guidance on how to practically manage open space, particularly with an aim towards taking advantage of the knowledge and skills that landscape architects and land use planners possess. And in fact, our team, if you notice, is comprised of individuals like myself. Andy Fox and Travis Klondike are both faculty in our department. Abby was our program manager. Claire Henkel was as well. And all of these students are either have graduated or will be graduating with degrees in landscape architecture, but also pursuing a graduate certificate in disaster resilient policy engineering and design. And so this is something I've been thinking about more and more as my background is land use planning and public policy, and really shifting in some ways my thinking and trying to better align what we know about natural hazards and disasters from a public policy standpoint and from a social science standpoint, but how do we better engage and align designers? And by that, I mean landscape architects, engineers, building scientists, and others, and better align that. And that's one of the themes of this presentation and the open space guide. As Jennifer alluded to, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Science and Technology, as well as the Coastal Resilience Center, provided funding for this work. FEMA was a supporter of the project, and in fact, on our advisory board, we had Brian Wilsey, as well as a number of people that you probably recognize in the field that are heavily involved in buyouts, floodplain management, studying open space management from an academic standpoint, those that are traditional designers, people in land use planning, as well as local government officials and even individuals from the nonprofit sector. So what we were really interested in doing is to get us started. We did extensive research on existing open space guides, looking at the content of those guides, and there really, frankly, weren't that many guides, but there were a lot of documents that dealt with open space plans that had been developed at the community level. We also did extensive work on development of case studies, which I'll talk about in just a moment, and thinking about how we link all of this information through and feedback provided by our advisory board and ultimately distributing it for publication. I'm going to speak to each of these issues in more detail throughout the rest of the presentation. So, for example, in the writing, this is just a screenshot of case studies, and we did case studies all over the country. We also developed what we called call-out boxes that address particular issues that we thought were particularly important. You can see checklists. There's an open space management team. And in fact, was looking at the guide earlier before this presentation, and it's quite extensive. It looks at not just government officials, for example, but nonprofits and corporations and small businesses, and even groups that emerge after disaster that we're not familiar with. And so we were looking at using different types of information, conveying information in different forms to help educate those that are grappling with this issue. We also work closely with an advisory board. These are simple screenshots of the questions that we asked our members of the advisory board. You know, everything from legibility to content. Were we missing information? Did it flow logically? And we sought and solicited their feedback, which offered significant improvements to the document. And then finally, we're going to be looking to distribute it. In fact, today, this is part of, if you will, our distribution strategy, is trying to share this with as many people as possible. If you're interested in the open space management guide, and I know Jennifer put it in the link, but you certainly can go to my ResearchGate site, and it's posted there, so you're certainly able to access it there as well. So who is the audience? What were we trying to accomplish with this? And so we, one of the things we purposely tried to do is we wanted it to have significant breadth, but we also wanted to make sure that we spent enough time looking at communities, not just the big cities, not just those that have a lot of experience in this space, but in many cases, we identified cases that were actually quite small and that most people had never heard of. In fact, literally, for example, Dauphin Island, they acquired 2 parcels, which seems insignificant, but it was significant in the sense that what they did with the land. They actually, these individual parcels were embedded in a community. One of the issues we all are familiar with is checkerboarding, and they turned them into pocket parks, which may not seem significant, but they walked through the process, including how they were able to get a neighborhood organization to take ownership of that space, not to physically own it, but to take ownership and manage and maintain that space. And now it is a real community asset. We also tried to look at geographic distribution. And as you'll note, if you'll note on the left-hand side, the case study locations underneath each one, like Oso, Washington, following the significant landslide, you'll see the word site design. Each of the guides had central elements or themes that we looked at: community needs assessment or maintenance of the property, how we address land use planning, and so forth, as part of the open space management process, which I think is a really important element. And I think it's something that's been missing in many guides. So again, I'll talk about this in a moment, but we really looked at different land use planning and architecture, landscape architecture techniques that could be employed in the development and management of these open space parcels. The guide is meant to inform local government officials, state and federal officials, as well as professionals, landscape architects, land use planners, emergency managers, floodplain administrators, and others that are often thrust into the process of managing this land in a thoughtful way, but also the community as a whole, thinking about individual residents, nonprofits. It could be business individuals. It could be groups like big box retailers that provide and donate supplies, materials, fertilizer, and what have you. It could be a local arts organization that actually creates a memorial artwork that's placed on the site. And we'll talk about this in just a moment too, because we addressed a number of important elements like memorialization in the guide. And I should also note the open space management team. I would encourage all of you to look at that, because we purposely wrote the open space management team as a very broad and inclusive process. Doesn't mean that each community would necessarily adopt that breadth of participants, but it really is quite broad, and I think it will appeal to a broad audience. So the overall goal of the process was to, as I alluded to earlier, apply land use planning and design principles. We did this recognizing that there are FEMA guidance, FEMA rules associated with this. And in fact, we even have a call out box on the legal issues surrounding open space management and the things that a local government would need to be aware of, which means, of course, the local government, if they have an attorney present, they should be part of the team. We also describe available resources. And in many cases in the disaster arena, we often think of funding as the predominant thing that we need. Funding is key, but as are the development or modification of policies to help you achieve certain goals, in this case, open space management, or it might be the ability to deliver and or obtain technical assistance. So we describe resources as funding, public policy, and technical assistance that help the community empower them to successfully manage these open spaces. The contents of the guide, just to give you, and I alluded to them earlier, we have a series of case studies, checklists, call-out boxes, tips, matrices, and appendices. I'm going to go through each of these in brief detail just to show you a little bit more about what I mean by those. The image on the right is kind of the framework, if you will, for the open space management process. As you can see, kind of in the inner or the secondary band of circles, land use planning, site design, and implementation. Whether you're developing this open space guide after a disaster or before, ideally thinking about this beforehand and talking about each of these specific elements, whether it's community engagement, planning services, design services, permitting, engagement, and so forth. It really breaks down the open space management process in extensive detail and provides that information in the document. So this is just one example of a case study. As you can see, they're all done in 2 pages, 2-page format, an introduction, the focus of the case study. In this case, it's the importance of developing diverse partnerships. And you can see within the categorization that we have categories and subcategories for each case study. What we did is we looked at well over 100 case studies across the country, started to organize them, look at key themes, and we actually broke them into both categories and subcategories. We kind of bunched them so that we could use these as ways to highlight key issues. And in this case, as I mentioned, the category is implementation for this case study, and the subcategory is the importance of developing diverse partnerships. You can also see within the in the document, at the very end of the document, we have case study lessons. And so what we've done is we've distilled all the case studies that I've shown in the map earlier on in the presentation into an appendices that has the case studies, the theme and sub-theme, as well as key takeaways. And I should also note, for example, Detroit, Michigan is one example. In some cases, we looked at open space management that wasn't necessarily directly tied to a buyout, but rather there were lessons to be drawn. In this case, Detroit, Michigan was looking at issues of environmental justice. And in some cases, as many of you know, as Detroit, many of their homes have fallen into disrepair. They're torn down, and then the city is actually struggling with what to do with that land. This is a case study that looks at that. So that's one example where it isn't, all the cases aren't necessarily explicitly FEMA-funded buyouts, but they are provided, they are intended to provide key information that's relevant for a buyout. So you can look at these broader categories: site design, community needs assessment, land planning, implementation and maintenance issues, as well as a whole host of subcategories we found in our national assessment. I mentioned memorialization. Environmental justice is another big issue we were grappling with, multi-objective planning, ecological restoration, and so on. Even how you can link buyouts to a community rating system and improving your community rating system score. This is an example of another type of informational technique that we're sharing. This is a checklist and getting into some of the details that sometimes you don't think about. But if you're a small community or a big community, in many cases, buyouts and some of the issues that you're grappling with, you're going to be soliciting this through a request for proposal. And so these are literally a set of questions that a community could ask a prospective candidate to really test to see how well they understand open space management. How deeply do they understand the value of community engagement? Have they done this work before? Did provide perhaps examples of how open space management could be linked to environmental justice. I mean, these are examples in here that are intended to give communities detailed information that they can act upon. Here's an example of a call out box where we're looking at, again, if you were to contract out services to do open space management, it goes into these issues in detail of land planning, site design, maintenance, monitoring, and so forth. Examples of tips, these are meant to be very succinct, topical areas that might be of interest. For example, how might you think about open space management and its relationship to nature-based solutions? The Nature Conservancy has developed a guide on that. How might you link losses avoided following buyouts? Or how might you engage with faculty, extension agents, and others at land-grant universities? They're just meant to be a very quick distillation of information or ideas that communities can act upon. The matrices or the matrix that I talked about earlier, these happen to be noted in the appendices, but these are tools that communities can use to start to organize your open space management team. Or the image on the right, this is a chance for you to start to organize some of the issues that you ought to be thinking about in open space management tied to land use planning, site design, and implementation, including these sub-elements. And then thinking about the types of resources that you might need, what type of money, what types of grants might be available, what types of technical assistance might you need to modify policies in your community to address these issues well. And all of these issues are talked about in detail throughout the guide. An example in the appendix is this happens to be a write-up or a kind of literature review of open space management, what we know about open space management, what we know about the challenges that it's often not given as much attention. It's an afterthought in some cases. Communities are often overwhelmed with the management or the management of the grant. And then they start to think about the open space management oftentimes in the aftermath. And that's actually the opposite of what we're trying to get communities to think about. And if you note the images on the bottom, these are just images that I happen to take in New Zealand following the Christchurch earthquake and some of the techniques that they're doing. For example, in New Zealand, they actually have a national agency that focuses on helping communities develop what they call regeneration plans that help them deal with open space management issues. And again, just to kind of in closing, to bring us back to some of the key issues that we wanted to achieve with this guide, is to think about how to apply land use planning and design principles, how this work can adhere to FEMA guidance and rules and regulations, but also how do you draw from the resources that many communities may not be aware of that they have at their disposal. And again, it's not just seeking money to do open space management, but it's also about soliciting assistance from other entities. It might be a nonprofit, it might be a garden center, it might be a faith-based organization, or it might be a small business. It's hard to say in terms of those that will provide the types of resources needed to ultimately empower these communities to manage open space following FEMA buyouts. So with that, I am going to stop, and I purposely kept the presentation short so that we could answer questions. And before we do that, actually, I'm going to ask if Abby has anything that she'd like to add to the conversation before we get started. Anything that they may have forgotten, Abby?
I think you touched on pretty much everything there. I'll just speak a little bit maybe about my experience working on this project. It was really interesting coming in and just even the process of research, finalizing what our end goal was going to be, how we're going to make this very practical and very accessible. I think that's really the strongest point of the guide, is that it's very accessible for communities who may not even know where to start or where to start looking for technical assistance, for funding, etc. And hopefully this guide can help with that and help others just to see, the starting place of putting together like an open space management team, for example. So I will say I really enjoyed working on the project, and yeah, hopefully it's a good question from Lori. She says, will you share more about the environmental justice case studies? I'd love to hear more about this and how the guide might be useful to environmental justice coordinators and federal agencies. I don't know if you want to say something, Gavin, but I'll chat for a little bit. So I thought specifically when you're talking about the Detroit case study, in that situation, the buyouts were tied to areas that have been contaminated, polluted by an oil refinery. So I think this would be certainly applicable for other areas of the country as far as knowing how to manage land. In Detroit specifically, that land next to the oil refinery was used as like an open space that could become a community amenity. So I think that could be useful as far as maybe some creative thinking around what to do with that land from buyouts.
Yeah, and maybe
something to add, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about, and that's great, Abby. I think maybe just to add a little bit to the kind of broader picture of this, and I alluded to this earlier, is the guide provides a wealth of information. It's also intended to show communities that may not be large or wealthy, or those that have an extensive staff, how they can do this. And the reason I mention that kind of tied to the equity issue is that sometimes what we found in practice is a lot of small communities really struggle with the management and the maintenance of the land after the buyout. Not only do they lose the tax base, but they are struggling to literally mow the grass, or as they'd say, to mow the grass, and that's it. And they view these as these checkerboard and vacant lots, and it's a real disamenity to the community. And so we We show them how to partner with everything from a local garden club to Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, big box retailers or landscaping companies that donate materials, nonprofits that might be willing to come in and create something that is a public amenity, like the case in Alabama, where someone came in and agreed to manage the land, and then people in the community take ownership of it. And so, again, while we do show cases of those communities like the Charlottes and Tulsas and others that have done great work, we also show examples of how communities that are small were able to do this, or those that are under-resourced, that don't have a lot of money to take on this activity, how they were able to make it happen.
Awesome. Thank you, Gavin and Abby, for the wonderful answer to Lori's question. And I'll skip her next question and save that for the end, because there is another one from Jim Cedino, who asks, is there a way to identify how many open space parcels are available within a community?
Well, I guess it depends, and it depends on the community's commitment to that. Some communities maintain a GIS data layer that has open space parcels, whether I guess one of the challenges is, are you referring explicitly to open space parcels tied to buyouts or open space in general? If it is open space parcels tied to buyouts, that would be part of the local government. That would be part of the process that they would have as part of the grant that they received. They would be required to document and maintain and manage that land. That is actually a legal requirement. And so it's the incumbent on the local government to have that accessible. Now, that said, there's variation there. Some communities, again, like a Charlotte or others, have it on a GIS data layer. They monitor it closely. They manage it well. Smaller communities, they may or may not have a GIS system. They may or may not have a very good way of recording and documenting those open space parcels, but it is a requirement. But I think there's some great variability. And I don't know if that answers the question adequately, but.
Great, thank you, Gavin. And feel free, everyone, to put some more questions in the chat box, and I will make sure those get answered. But I have a question for you. I'm actually really interested in thinking about how you engage communities across this process when there's sometimes so much negative, so many negative feelings about the buyout programs and such. So how do you even begin the community engagement process to get people on board with what they can do then with that vacant space afterwards and be part of the process where they see it as that added benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the broad themes of the guide too is that communities ought to be proactive and be thinking about the possibility of buyouts occurring before they occur. And so talking with communities, talking with individuals to at least let them know their risk and whether should there be funding, or should the community actually develop their own open space management, the buyout program. Places like Charlotte and Tulsa and others have done that. So ideally, talking with people, letting them know their risk, asking and discussing whether they would be interested in something like this, because what often happens is in the aftermath of a disaster, state government and FEMA and others come in and say, oh, look, by the way, there's this program that can be used for buyouts. Would you be interested in participating? And that's in the throes of the disaster when their house is likely to have been damaged or flooded already. So that's one issue, is to do it proactively. If you have to do it in the aftermath of a disaster, this is an issue too, is to think through how to engage the community in something in fora, for example, other than just a public meeting. That is a common approach. The public meeting is, to me, and in fact, the research shows this, it's one of the least effective community participatory planning tools to utilize that, but rather, again, I keep going back to the Charlotte example, and they have the staff and ability to do this, but what they have done is they have actually sat down one-on-one with individuals. Sometimes literally they will talk to people in their backyard, or they will host events where people can get together and talk in general about the idea as well in advance of the process actually happening. So, the idea of engaging with people over long timescales, engendering some level of trust, and doing this in a way that is respectful of these areas. Another issue to recognize, and we've seen, we did not put in cases that were problematic, in the sense of there are a lot of communities where buyouts have occurred and the land is now overgrown. People have dumped trash and materials, and then they have Jersey barriers surrounding these sites. And that's a disservice to those people who lost their homes. And so talking with communities and citizens about this and having them play a role in planning how they might memorialize the site. For example, the Oso, Washington case is a good example where this was discussed after a devastating mudslide that killed a large number of people. And they worked over long periods of time to talk with the former residents and current residents that remained what to do with that open space. And they ultimately developed a pretty powerful memorial that's also a set of recreational trails. And that didn't just happen overnight. It took a lot of time. And in fact, it even led to some private sector firms donating their time and expertise to do this kind of work, which is kind of another example, a theme of the document, which is it's not just about money. It might be about providing technical assistance or expertise, either as pro bono or through some other venue.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Lorenzo, who says, noticing the developed parks, et cetera, in the presentation, can you briefly discuss the land use restrictions for buyout properties?
Sure, and that is, so there is a call out box in the guide that explicitly walks through in great detail the legal aspects of a buyout, including everything from searching for multiple heirs that might own a piece of property. It deals with issues of specific uses that can be things that can be done on the land, dealing with everything from the ability to create greenways and trails to open air gazebos, talking about parking lots that are not created with impervious surfaces. The idea that you're not able to rebuild back other structures other than a very specific or limited type of structure. So those are a few of the elements, but those restrictions are very specifically identified and described in the guide. I don't know, Abby, if you want to add anything to that, and actually while you do that, if you have anything to add, I'm going to literally look up the legal section in the guide.
Sure, I'm not sure that I have too much to add, but when you were talking about that, my mind went to like the Grand Forks case study, that it's really this super cool greenway system, very, it took a lot of engineering and willpower to get through. And that's certainly more developed, but that in that specific case, the greenway system, if I'm not mistaken, and Gavin, correct me if I'm wrong, was a bigger project. So I'm not sure that every portion of the greenway had the same restrictions that a buyout parcel would have. But yeah, I don't know, Gavin, if that's the correct thought process there or not. Feel free to speak up if it's not.
Could you repeat that just very briefly? I was looking
Sure,
at
yeah. So when talking about a more developed type looking park, my mind went to the Grand Forks case study, and that was not, if I'm not mistaken, not every part of that greenway system or trail park was part of a buyout.
Yeah, well, and so that project adds a little bit of complexity too, is that it involved Army Corps of Engineers funding for buyouts as well as FEMA funding for buyouts, which had different rules and regulations associated with it. So that's a whole nother set of issues, and we do talk about that in the guide. But to address some of the issues tied to it's actually on page 42, it's the legal aspects of open space management. So it talks about everything from reporting, allowable uses, model deed restrictions that you could employ to limit future development, titles, easements, land use changes, how you transfer land, how you derive revenue from the open space, should you do that, takings law, condemnation, heirs property, deconstruction of housing, maintenance of land and property, and so on. And in fact, the deconstruction, there's actually a little tip on there on deconstruction. I'm just looking at the guide. It also, we use the example of Lyons, Colorado, where the homes were actually, some homes were deconstructed. They were taken apart and used for salvage material with certain limitations placed on them. For example, benches, gazebos, other uses that could be actually placed on buyout lands. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, and then Mary Baker has a question. She says, did you include any communities that were also looking at relocation as part of their acquisition efforts?
When you say relocation, the physical movement of the community to higher ground, or is
Yes.
that yes? Yeah. So we did in a couple of ways, so kind of informally in some ways. There are examples of communities that did pursue the buyout and then were looking to develop replacement housing. And so that's discussed in the guide. Yes, and it's also discussed in the appendix. We talk about buyouts as part of a managed retreat strategy, which I think is what you might be getting at. I mean, and it depends on the term that's used, but now more and more communities and academics are starting to talk about buyouts and land acquisition as part of a managed retreat strategy. The idea of a thoughtful movement of communities out of harm's way, in many cases tied to issues associated with climate change. And so there is a section in the appendix that talks about that specifically. In fact, in that case, we use, in part, that's what I showed I was referencing the work that was being done in New Zealand following the Christchurch earthquake.
Great. We have a Q&A box question from Katrina. She says, have you looked into the usefulness of USDA programs that may be a resource for communities considering these strategies? And then she drops the link in there, or NRCS.
Right. So we didn't, and Abby, you correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't do that. We were very much focused on FEMA buyouts. And this is another issue and it's a good question. More and more agencies are looking at doing this. NRCS, the Corps of Engineers has been doing it for many, many years. But for the purposes of this study, we really very much focused on that. In fact, that was one of the comments from the advisory board. Said, why didn't you talk more about HUD money? Why didn't you talk about USDA? Why didn't you talk about these other? And I think it's a really important issue. And in fact, we probably, in hindsight, one of the things we could have done is perhaps added, if nothing else, a call out box, because communities, and we did talk about it in some cases, like in Grand Forks, they patched together a number of different funding sources, federal agency funding sources, to deal with buyout. So it wasn't just FEMA based, but we really didn't focus in on those other agencies. But it is an important issue, especially as we start to talk more and more about buyouts as a managed retreat strategy. There very well be multiple agencies involved. The other thing I would mention is we did touch on it briefly, is as a kind of a note for individuals participating in buyouts, is for example, FEMA buyout money and HUD buyout money. They often have different rules. They have different time implementation periods, if you will. They have different requirements. HUD money, especially that is supplemental appropriations following a federal disaster. Those rules are different for every disaster. And so that adds complexity to the process. So this issue of bringing or combining different funding sources for buyouts is a really important one to have to be aware of.
Great, thank you, Gavin. We have a question from Casey who says, what was the biggest hurdle you and/or the community encountered during the buyout process? What could be done to make this process more efficient at the state community level?
Well, I guess what I'll do is maybe put my former hat on in government. I'm just thinking about this as an example, and I believe we may have touched on it in the guidance. I don't know that we did, but a quick story is following Hurricanes Fran in 1996 and Floyd in 1999 in North Carolina. Those were the two seminal events at the time, and it led to the acquisition of more than 5,000 homes. After Hurricane Fran, it took almost a year for us to develop an individual application for a community of about 360 homes. took us a year to write the application, which actually even today, that's fairly fast. I mean, and which is unfortunate, shouldn't take that long. Well, this town is the town of Kinston, North Carolina. They once they saw that buyouts were occurring, a lot of people that initially didn't want to participate because they didn't think it was actually going to happen, they saw it happening. They wanted to participate, but the money was all allocated and there was no more money. So they developed a pre-disaster buyout application in anticipation of a future event. In 1999, 3 years later, a major flood tied to Hurricane Floyd happened. The town submitted the application and the state and FEMA approved it a week after the storm. That was an additional 500 or 600 homes that were basically approved for buyout a week after the event, which is incredibly fast. And it is because they did all of the necessary work. They met with the individuals, they talked about this, they did benefit cost analysis, they looked at multiple heirs, they did all the title searches on the land, they combined it, put it in an application, and it was ready to go in anticipation of a funding source. And that, to me, is an example of, just one example of how you can be prepared to deal with that, to deal with the challenges of a buyout, is to do this as you would in a thoughtful, pre-planned way.
Great, thank you. We have another question here that says, did any of the communities run into historic preservation concerns or considerations in the buyout program process?
Abby, do you want to, anything come to mind on that?
Not in the open space management guide, but I will say that Gavin has a different research project going on dealing with that very issue. From the case studies within the guide, though, I don't believe that there are any that touched on that. But yeah, maybe Gavin, if you have an example or know of something.
Yeah, what I can talk to is the historic preservation issue is the acquisition of historic properties. And so that is touched on in the guide relative to buyouts and things like recordation of historic properties prior to the acquisition, and in this case, demolition of those structures. Other options could be, if they're historic properties, they could be, if they're salvageable, picked up and moved. Of course, that changes their historic context. I mean, these are just a few issues that, that are tied to the actual buyout of historic properties. I will say, again, when I was in government, we also elevated about 380 houses in one town, Belhaven, North Carolina, and many of them were historic properties. And so we learned a lot on the fly about elevating historic properties and trying to deal with things like elevated foundations and trying to develop historically accurate foundational facades and so forth that would mimic the architectural style of the structure. I mean, those are just a few examples, but the open space management piece, one of the issues from a historic preservation standpoint is to think about that. And actually, Abby alluded to another project we're working on with the state of North Carolina, is looking at addressing historic properties and landscapes. And in terms of open space management, is thinking through how you might seek to develop a open space management strategy that tries to respect the historic significance of a particular site. One thing I will mention in the guide, we do reference, for example, Ile de Jean Charles. I know there was someone talking about buyouts and resettlement, or buyouts and managed retreat. As many of you may know, Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana is participating in a pretty significant relocation effort, and it's funded by HUD. And one of the ways that they are thinking through these issues, and they're also doing it in Alaska, and looking at Native American lands and trying to reach agreements with tribes to think about the ability of those that are participating in a buyout that can come back and utilize that land with certain parameters placed on it. I don't know if that's getting at your question, but these are some of the issues that are kind of linking open space management and issues of historic preservation. So it's not just the physical structure to me, but it's also like the historic landscapes, but also, being culturally sensitive and or looking at the importance of maintaining cultural landscapes.
Great, thank you, Gavin. We have a couple more questions. Veronica says, any guidance on a community leasing the open space?
Yeah, and that is in the guide. We do have that, and I believe it's in the legal call out box and we do give examples of this where communities have actually leased back the land, often to adjacent property owners. That happens sometimes when you're doing buyouts. I didn't talk about it in great detail, but many of you know that are involved in buyouts, because it is a voluntary process, that you may have individuals that take the buyout and those that don't. And some communities have developed lease agreements for that parcel that may be adjacent to a homeowner that stayed. And they often use that for a community garden. It could be an individual's garden, but also, if possible, if the properties are clustered, we do provide examples where they are leasing that back to like a community that can use it as a neighborhood garden. So there are examples in the guide that deal with that.
Great. Next question is, does the guide identify instances where a community encountered potential liability issues with its planned open space use that it had to address and minimize?
Well, I'm literally looking back in the section on the legal aspects of open space management. It starts on page 42. And so we deal with challenges of multiple heirs, transfer of ownership, leasing agreements, and we have embedded in there different examples of communities that have developed documents that they could use to deal with some of those issues. We also look at issues of land adjacent to buyouts and or condemnation of land adjacent to buyouts and these types of issues, and the importance of making sure that you work with your state hazard mitigation officer because they are on the conduit between what the federal rules tied to the buyouts and what can be achieved on the ground. I don't know, Abby, if you have anything to add to that.
I don't, but
Okay.
That was very succinctly said. Yep.
Okay.
Great, and we have about almost 10 more minutes for Q&A, so keep those questions rolling in, everybody. We can turn now to Lori's other question, since there aren't any other ones right now. And she asks, will you share a little bit more about the future research needs that you are working on that this guide sparked for you?
Yeah, well, and it does align with another project. Abby's not part of this one. Actually, I've hired Abby after graduation, so she's got a full-time job and working with us on a historic preservation and hazards guide. But we're also working on a guide that is creating a coastal hazards overlay district. In essence, a tool that coastal communities can use that deal with issues of managed retreat or avoidance, or even protect and accommodate strategies. And so one of the interesting issues and challenging issues is the degree to which buyouts can actually be used as part of a managed retreat strategy in the coastal zone or elsewhere. And so that's one of the issues we're looking at. We've also come up with a series of, in the back of the guide, in the appendix, a series of potential issues to grapple with and recommendations that those individuals might want to either research or deal with as practitioners. And so I'm actually, Lori, I'm scrambling to kind of look to see if there are other specific research questions in the guide. One of the things I should also say is and I'm looking at the guide quickly, is something that we recommend is to do a better job of developing peer-to-peer networks. And those individuals that have experience in open space management and thinking through how those can be facilitated. And one of the other big projects we're working on is looking to create, and I'll talk about this at the Natural Hazards Workshop, is how do we harness the capacity of universities, including land-grant universities, minority serving institutions, and others to provide assistance with issues associated with open space management, but also hazard mitigation grants management, if you will. And this is part of a large project that we are working on with FEMA to identify a national cadre of individuals, faculty, extension agents, and for example, research professors and faculty that can offer that assistance. And actually to date, we've identified over 600 people at universities across the US and every state and territory that could offer that assistance. We're again working with FEMA to kind of harness that capability. We're going to be surveying them and assessing their capacity to offer assistance and their commitment, and then ultimately looking to develop a national framework that will help FEMA better harness that capacity and link it to the work that's already being done on direct technical assistance through consultants and or FEMA staff. That's one example of taking some of the work that we're doing in the open space guide and linking it to additional research and practice.
Great. And Jim asked how he can get a copy of the guide, and I just threw the link to this webinar webpage on our website that has a link where you could go and download the guide for free. But in addition to that, Gavin, do you have, I know that in the guide there's a lot of places where like there's tables that you could fill in if you were a community person wanting to go through this process. Do you have any of those resources that are usable to download as well, separate from the guide?
Well, so they're all embedded in the guide, and actually, I believe that you can actually readily access those through the guide. And Abby, I'm trying to remember. I think I guess it's a PDF, but I'm trying to remember if we have those as links or not. I don't know that we do.
We don't have them as separate documents, but if you do look at the PDF, you could potentially just print the one page. Gavin, maybe that's something we could work on getting as a separate document to put on your research gate. That shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions right now, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any communities that, since this has been published, that have maybe started using this guide that you know of.
Let's see. So I know I did hear from, I've heard from former state hazard mitigation officer or current places like Pennsylvania and others that have started to say that they're sharing it and distributing it with others. I haven't heard of a community per se that started to use that, but this is one of the reasons we want to, start to share this and let people know that it's out there. And for anyone that's on in this meeting, feel free to share this with others. That's really the intent of the guide. It's not meant to just sit there. It wasn't just meant to be an exercise, but rather it's really meant to be used. And I like to think that it's got a good mix of information that's grounded in practice that would be of use, based on my own personal experiences working as a state official, working with hundreds and hundreds of communities, dealing with large-scale buyouts and seeing a lot of these communities struggle with this very issue. So please feel free to share those with others.
And Gavin, do you know that in terms of like FEMA buyouts, if FEMA has any intention of offering resources to places that are being bought out and properties so that people can then start to make those decisions about their own communities? Or is it something that FEMA's kind of work stops there in terms of the buyout program?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say their work stops there. I mean, they are very focused on the delivery of information about grants management. There is information out there on the use of open space. In general, it's kind of a list of options for communities to consider. And one of the things we try to do is to fill a gap in the sense that, I mean, it walks you through the details. It's like what we would call in landscape architecture land programming. How do you think about that site? What options might you consider that would be the best use of that site that also meet FEMA rules and regulations, but also draw from the ability and the importance of connecting with the people who once lived there and the community and the people that still reside in the adjacent areas, to get them deeply engaged in the process. And so again, applying both landscape architecture and land use planning techniques in depth to walk through that process. I have not seen that in any other guide. And so that's really one of the key purposes of this effort is to give communities detailed information that they can act upon.
Great, thank you. I know Tracy here shared a link to the Pew Trust report on property buyouts. And then Jim put a reference in there, 44 CFR Part 80. Jim, do you want to tell us a
Yes.
little bit more about what that part is? Or Gavin, do you know what that is?
I do, and in fact, again, on page 42, we do cite that at the very beginning. So there are very specific guidance materials in the Code of Federal Regulations about the utilization of buyout lands. And so it's cited in the document, but and that's important. There's no doubt that you need to adhere to that guidance. But again, it's actually it's the written word. It's fairly dense. It's fairly brief. And so it talks about, what you can do with the land in a general sense. But what we tried to do is to not only do that and to cite that in the legal requirements that you must adhere to, but show the breadth of options that communities have to achieve that that short narrative that's in CFR, whether it's, a memorial park in Oso, a pocket park in Alabama, or whether it's an extensive greenway system in Charlotte and Tulsa, whether it's used for educational purposes, whether it's tied to issues of equity and encouraging people to utilize that land to look at addressing food deserts and those types of things. So it's a breadth of issues and examples that communities can look at that, and actually it shows it visually what they might look like, in addition to just a real succinct write-up of the open space regulations.
Great. Yeah. And Jim says the codes allow for a lot of creative use of open space. Awesome presentation, which I very much agree with. So we do have time maybe for one more question. If anybody has any final burning thoughts or things they would like Gavin and Abby to answer. And if
Jen,
not,
if there's not, I guess I just would say one thing. I can't now. I'm my brain is maybe frozen, but I'm trying to remember if you did mention that we will be showing this. We'll actually have a poster at your annual conference. So there'll be, if people have other questions at the conference, we'll certainly be able to talk more with them at that time.
perfect. And if you could stop sharing your screen, I'm going to go ahead and cover a few more things at the end of the presentation here. Let me share my screen really quick as a wrap up. Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, Gavin, Abby, thank you so much for this crucially important conversation. This is such a benefit to the entire buyout program process and to the communities who are facing these risks and hoping to improve their communities after these buyout programs happen, and make these spaces an asset to their livability and safety. So in addition to offering gratitude to both of you as speakers and the authors of this guide for the outstanding effort, we also want to thank FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. And we are so grateful for all the attendees who joined us today. And so before we close, I just have a couple brief announcements. First, please remember to contact hazctr@colorado.edu if you do plan to use the one contact hour toward your CEUs for emergency management training and certification through IAEM. That all this information is also on our website, but please send an email to Katie Murphy if you would like to receive that certificate for today. Okay. Okay, we also hope that you will make sure that you're signed up for updates to the Natural Hazard Center website so that you receive notifications about upcoming webinars and other free resources and information that we provide through the Hazard Center, including signing up for our Natural Hazards Workshop announcements. And then to that end, I would like to remind everyone that the 48th Annual Natural Hazards Workshop is only 25 days away. If you're interested in joining us and you haven't already registered, please do so now. The workshop will take place in Broomfield, Colorado at the Omni Interlaken Hotel from July 9th to the 12th, with a researchers meeting following on the 12th and 13th and a practitioners meeting on July 13th, all at the Omni Hotel. And if you can't attend in person, we do have a virtual registration option to get access to a live streaming of the keynote and the plenary sessions during the workshop. So just those sessions will be live streamed for anybody who signs up for the virtual option. And we are filling up very quickly, so we will need to move to a wait list once we reach our max capacity of 650 attendees. So if you are thinking about coming, please do register soon. And of course, while you're there, please do visit Abby at the poster that Gavin just mentioned, because they will be presenting this work in a poster format at the workshop. Okay, and finally, we hope that you will save the date for our next Making Mitigation Work webinar. Please join us on Tuesday, August 15th from 11 to 12 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And on behalf of the entire Natural Hazard Center team, we just want to thank you again and our presenters for all of the work you've done so far in this guide. And we just can't wait to see what happens with it in the future. And we look forward to seeing everyone again in August. Thank you very much.